I think it's a masterpiece. I basically think it's a perfect movie. I mean, I don't have any problem with really any part of it. I think from the writing, which I think is incredible, to the performances, which I think are also incredible, and I think John Huston really proves that he is an important filmmaker who is just launching onto the scene. And I think everything about this film to me is perfect, and I can just watch it anytime. I don't know how many times I've seen it, but it's one of those rare movies that I can just watch, and I'll always enjoy it. So I can't recommend it highly enough.
I would disagree in calling it a perfect film when I've seen better Bogart movies. I've seen better John Huston movies. And there are elements of the film that they're not really that high on the scale of what you look for in movies. Locations, cinematography, there are things that I would say it's hard for me to call it perfect when certain elements aren't really that high. It is a very low budget film. It looks and feels low budget. It almost feels like a stage play in certain ways because there are a lot of long scenes. There are even like scenes that are cut into scenes, like short little cutaway scenes, just to break up the location. Whereas a scene could go 20 minutes in one location, they'll just cut in like a really short, quick scene just to make just to break that one long scene up. And even the whole third act is just one room. So I can't call it perfect because of things like that, but it is one of the best films I've ever seen. It is one of the greatest detective films. It is one of the greatest film noirs. It is one of the greatest John Huston films. It is one of the greatest Humphrey Bogart films. It is one of the greatest mystery films. So when you look at all these categories, while it's not number one in any of these categories, it's top 10 in a lot of categories. And it is easily one of the greatest films I've ever watched. It's incredibly rewatchable because for me, the most one of the most rewatchable films is a good mystery. Because a good mystery is going to be complex enough that you know where it's going, but the details always confuse you if you haven't seen it in a while. You're like, yeah, I know the basics of what's happening. I know where it's going to end up, but how do all these details fill in the blanks again? For movies like this and Laura, it to me those are like incredible mysteries because again, the end result, you know where it's going, Mulholland Drive, you know where it's ending up, but it's so complex and it's so well done, and the characters give it so much nuance, or it's just like, yeah, I'm 90% sure that's their motive. But there's always that 10% chance that, like, am I sure that that was their intention? You know? And that level of doubt, that level of complexity, to me is what make mystery movies incredibly rewatchable and why mystery movies are some of the most fun to rewatch. And this is definitely well up there with that as well. And then when you throw in the historical significance of launching film noirs, launching the careers of an important filmmaker and an important director. Um, I'm sorry, I said filmmaker and director, same thing. Filmmaker and actor.
Yes, yes.
So, yeah, for things like that, and even for character actors, like, yeah, the history of cinema may not, you know, Sidney Greenstreet may be a footnote of a footnote on the history of cinema, but he was he's still there, and this launched his career, and yeah, there's just a lot to like about the movie. Without getting into full spoilers for a movie that, again, was made, before your grandmother or your grandfather were even born. Some people watching this. If you don't know the exact details, or if you're, depending on how you're watching this, what type of format you're watching it in, you could be watching it in the format of a watch along. Um, it's just worth experiencing for yourself without me flat out saying how it fully plays out and how it ends because It also has one of the greatest endings of all time. My favorite filmmaker of all time is Stanley Kubrick, and what makes Kubrick one of the best defining attributes of a Kubrick film is it always ends on a crescendo. It's like, yeah, this is the only way this movie could end. The only way 2001 A Space Odyssey could end with is with a fucking space baby, that turns into like, the evolution of man, like Superman born, and spoiler for that movie. But yeah, this movie ends with the perfect ending for this movie. There was another ending that was shot, and I'm glad they didn't use it because the the final frame of Mary Astor's character, the final dialogue of Bogart's character is just so perfect. The added tacked on scene may work for the book or something like that, but I'm glad they decided to shelf the final scene. I'm glad the Warner Brothers decided that they didn't want to force this first time director into going with the original ending and to just go with his instincts, and they embraced the ending that he chose. Um, yeah, there's just so much that worked out well for this movie, you know, that
Yeah,
I'm very high recommend.
yeah, yeah. And you raise a good point. Like some people say to me, "Oh, I know who the killer is in this movie, so it's boring." And I think to myself, no, I know who the killer is in this movie, and I've watched it a dozen or 2 dozen times. And I think one of the things that John Huston talked about is that he got a piece of advice from one of the producers, and that was treat every scene as if it's the most important scene in the movie. And I think that that's good advice. And he thought it was the best advice he'd ever gotten. And I think that's what makes these movies work is that it's not all about the big ending, the big reveal. It's about everything along the way, all the interesting scenes, the interesting moments. Every scene is good, and you just want to watch all these scenes. And it doesn't matter if you know how it's going to end. It's still a great movie and it's still entertaining. And oddly enough, that was one of the few places where this movie departs from the book is not including the final scene. And I agree with you. I think they did not need it, and that was a good choice. So, yeah,
I think this is something that we talked about, or at least I've brought up before, because I think everyone, not just you and I, everyone watches or experiences things through their own lens. And for me, I always watch a film from a filmmaker's perspective. Like before I decided I wanted to make films, I mainly watched a lot of TV shows, Twilight Zone, things like that, Simpsons. But when I became like when I decided I really wanted to make movies and I really started examining films, I started examining it from a filmmaker's perspective. And I think a lot of times you watch it from a writer's perspective. I think that's why you call this perfect and why All About Eve is your favorite movie, because both the weaknesses of these two incredibly great films are things that wouldn't bother someone coming from a writer's perspective. Lack of locations and things like that, the stage play feel of it and your pass with the stage. Um, but one thing that I emphasize a lot is there are different styles of making movies that can make movies completely different, and there's no right or wrong way of doing something. Just like we talked about All About Eve, you know what, that particular filmmaker, what's his name again?
Mankiewicz.
Mankiewicz, he hated movement of the camera. You can't move the camera. Focus on the actors. And then you have when we did Solaris, Tarkovsky had a completely different view of making movies, but they both made great movies, but their movies are incredibly different. Um, and I think there's a similar thing to this in that you're saying where Houston took the advice of make every scene important. And I think that works when you shoot a movie in the way this movie is shot, where there's not a lot of locations and it's just about performing the scenes well. It's not about dealing with elements. You're in a studio, it's a controlled environment. You're not dealing with variables, you're dealing with absolutes. you're not going to be rained out. Weather is not going to affect your shoot. The sunlight is not going to affect, when you can shoot, when you can't shoot, when you have to stop shooting. Traffic, pedestrians. It's completely controlled environment. No variables. Stuntmen, anything like that. It's just all talking and dialogue, and it's just about getting the actors to get the timing right. So for a movie like this, or All About Eve, every scene can be the most important scene in a movie. But when you're a filmmaker like Kubrick or a filmmaker like Tarkovsky, which are both very different filmmakers, or even Orson Welles, again, three very different filmmakers, but they have other elements that can be variables to the way they make movies. So they can't afford to make every scene the important scene. And I think it was Howard Hawks that said to make a great movie, make every scene has to be average to good, and you need about five great scenes. Just no bad scenes. Don't have bad scenes. Just make sure every scene is average to good and have five great scenes and you're good. And I think Kubrick's philosophy was more so your movie is going to be made or broken based on how you allocate your time. You have X amount of days to make this movie. You can't spend the same amount of time on every scene. You have to pick the scenes that are the most important to you and spend the most amount of time on those scenes. So everyone has their own philosophy. And like they say, there's a bunch of different ways to skin a cat. So I think with this style of movie, I think that definitely works for a Mankiewicz or a John Huston. But I think there are other ways to make movies as well, based on how you make them and what you're aiming to create. So yeah, I think this style of making movies definitely work for this movie in particular. Maybe for others, not so much, but for this movie in particular, I think that's the perfect approach to have for it.
Yeah, and I've heard that other advice too, and I think that's very good advice, especially on a budget, and limited time. It's like pick the scenes that you think are the most important and really put time into those, and then some of the other scenes aren't as important, so you don't have to spend as long on them. And I think that does make perfect sense.
Yeah, why
Interesting.
spend a day of an exposition scene that's just trying to get information across? And then you're going to spend a full day on that and then a full day on the climax scene. Why
Yeah,
not just get that exposition scene done in a half a day or a quarter day so you can double up your time on the critical scene, you know?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And interestingly, John Huston apparently shot this film in order, in chronological order. It's a very rare thing to do, but it's almost like a play in that way, where they start with the first scene and then they do the second scene. And it's sort of helpful, I guess, to the actors because they always know, okay, this is what I've done and this is what I'm doing next. It's hard when you jump around and have to remember, okay, well, when does this scene take place? So it was an interesting choice that he made, and it might add to that feel a little bit. Um,
And
but
again, it's you can only do that approach with certain movies. If you
yeah,
had to go like Istanbul for this scene and France for this scene, it's like, all right, we're going to France, we're going to shoot this scene. Okay, we're done with that scene. We're not shooting any of the France scenes because the next scenes are in New York, and then we're going to come back to France, and then we're
yeah,
going to you can't, obviously
no, no,
when you're doing something like this where it's just one studio set to another studio set, you can do it chronologically. And it does help the actors, especially if it's a mysterious movie that gets them confused. But if you have like different locations, you can't be bouncing around back and forth
yeah,
because you want to shoot it chronologically.
no, totally. And apparently they were ahead of schedule and they often had time to kill and they would hang out at the golf club or somewhere and people thought they were kind of crazy because they weren't using their time, but they were, they John Huston had everything under control and he planned it all out very meticulously and it went off pretty smoothly, I guess. So uh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
But,
I would say the biggest flaw of this movie, honestly, is that it wasn't serious enough.
mm,
Yeah, I mean, if it were just a little bit more serious, I mean, you could have had
Maybe, oh yeah, you could have had George Raft in it.
You could have had a George Raft in it
Yes,
or Geraldine Fitzgerald, you
that's
know,
right. That's right.
if it was just a little bit more serious.
Well, if it was a period piece where they were in costumes, French costumes from the 1600s or something, that would have been more serious, I think.
Yeah, yeah. A little bit more Vaseline on the
Yeah.
screen.
Yes.
Any trivia to wrap us up or no?
Yeah, well, I do have some trivia, and I mean, I could almost turn this into trivia as well. Humphrey Bogart and John Huston, they wound up collaborating a number of times over the years. Do you know how many times they did? And do you know what those films are?
Beat the Devil, which is the first movie I've seen with them together, and one of their worst movies.
The last,
Um,
yeah,
oh, it was the last one.
it was
Okay.
the last one, yeah.
I know it lost them both a lot of money because they financed it together or something like that.
Yeah,
Beat the Devil, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
yes,
Um, this one obviously makes three.
yes,
Jeez, I know Bogart made hundreds of movies. How
yes.
many would he have made with John Huston? Um, Huston didn't direct The African Queen, did he?
Yes, he did.
Oh, The African
Yes,
Queen.
yes,
Um, geez, I know it's more than four.
yes, it is. Yes, indeed.
Um, Houston. I think they did more movies that was written by oh, that famous writer. Um, I would say maybe nine,
Not quite nine.
six.
Six. I believe it's a
Okay.
total of
What
six.
are the two I'm missing?
Across the Pacific, 1942.
Oh, I didn't know he directed that one. Okay.
Yeah, and Key Largo, 1948.
Oh, why did I think Key Largo was a Howard Hawks film?
I don't know.
Okay. Six. Well, I got four out of the six. It's not terrible.
No, no, that was pretty good. Uh, so here's a question. Do you know how many days it took to shoot the final scene between Bogart and Mary Astor, this final
Three.
client? Yes, that's correct. 3 days. 3 days.
Three sounds about right.
Yeah,
As a filmmaker, I would give it 3 days because
yeah,
it's a long scene. You figure one day to fully rehearse it, block it, map it out, get what you're doing. One day to really get the everything you want from the actors. And then you want to do a day where the actors are exhausted and they can't think. They just have to read the lines and they're not blocked from this is how I'm supposed to do it. You almost want to break them and then have them keep going. So for me as a filmmaker, I always three is always the right number for me.
okay. It's good to know.
Yeah.
Humphrey Bogart actually had to supply something for this movie,
His
which is,
clothes.
that's right, his own
Back
wardrobe.
then, yeah, back then, Hollywood was very cheap.
Well,
Actors, I don't think it's for this movie. I think just in general, a
yeah.
lot of actors supplied their own wardrobe and I think even their own makeup in the 30s and 40s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, at Warner Brothers, it was definitely common. They were trying to save a bit of money, but they
Yeah.
did.
I
They,
think I think some famous actors, especially actresses, would pay for their own makeup people. But I do know like they made them go out of pocket for a lot of stuff because they were contracted. It's like, hey, you're on a contract. You have this amount of money. You're responsible for your own hair and makeup or whatever, you know?
yeah.
What do you think we're paying you for? You know, type thing.
Yeah. So early in the film, Sam Spade walks past a poster for a non existent movie, which is called The Girl from Albany, which was kind of a joke aimed at Warner Brothers because they had actually wanted to rename this movie, The Maltese Falcon. They wanted to give it a different name because they felt, well, we already did The Maltese Falcon in 1931, so they wanted a different name. And The Girl from Albany was kind of a spoof of what they had wanted. Do you know the name that they had wanted to use for this movie?
Is it similar to the girl from Albany or no?
It is similar.
The girl from San Francisco?
Well, close, close. It's actually
The
the
girl from, is it the girl from, is, am I, or am I
no.
wrong? Okay.
You got the gender wrong there.
Oh, the man from San Francisco?
Close, close, but it's actually the gent from Frisco.
What a fucking awful name.
Yeah, thank God they didn't go with that. The gent
Jesus
from
Christ.
Frisco.
What a terrible name.
Yeah, so thankfully they did not do that.
The gent from
Um,
Frisco. God.
Now, here's an interesting thing, which I didn't even realize, but there is a cameo in this movie.
Mm.
Um,
Oh, I
Captain
saw it. I
Jacoby.
saw it. It was Houston's father. What the hell is
Yes,
John Houston's father? Walter
Walter
Houston?
Walter Houston. Yes.
Yeah.
So
I'm a
I
big
didn't.
Walter Houston fan. I think he was in a movie. Was it? It was that movie with Gary Cooper. I think he was in a movie with that was really good.
Yeah.
And I know he was in a movie, The Treasure of Sierra Madre. He was great in that. But I
Yes.
do know he liked putting his father in his movies. I think there was a movie with Gary Cooper, a Western. I know Gary Cooper made this really good Western with an older actor, and the older actor stole the whole movie from him. I think it was Walter Houston that stole the movie from him.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, Walter Houston was pretty good. He didn't really play a ton of memorable characters when he was young, but definitely Travis Madre was incredible in that movie. And
Yes.
yeah, I did see his face when he fell down on the couch in that
Okay.
scene.
Yeah, I did not notice that, but that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Now Elijah Cook Jr., who plays Wilmer, um, uh, he was supposed to be quite young. They claimed he's quite young in this movie. You know,
They
he's
kept
just
calling him kid.
yeah, but he's actually not as young as he's reputed to be. Do you know how old he was when he made this film?
Oh, they called him kids. I'm assuming he was supposed to be in his early 20s, late
Yeah,
teens.
he was supposed to be 20, apparently, roughly 20. Yeah,
Mm. Um, geez, could he be in his 30s? Could he be 30?
he was over 30, in fact.
Really? He looks pretty
Yeah,
good for 32,
higher,
34?
higher.
No way.
Yeah,
36?
higher.
There's no way he was older than 36?
He was.
38?
He was 38, if you can believe it.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm shocked because he does look really young.
He does.
And you see him in a lot of movies over the years, and he looks really young here. Like this is one of his first, but 38 years old?
Well, that was interesting trivia. This is the best I think I've done in trivia.
Yeah, not
No?
bad at all. Not bad.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Well, that was an awesome movie. Thank you
It
guys
was.
for spending that time with us. And until we meet again.